Hi everyone, thank you for joining us this morning for our webinar on value metrics for journal editors. First of all, I introduce myself. My name is Rachel Lee and I'm the Library Relations Manager for the press. And I will run through some quick housekeeping items and some general introductions for our presenters before we begin. We put this webinar together as a response to the many questions that we get and the information that we see generally about value metrics for journals, such as the impact factor and other metrics. There's a lot of confusion, and so we wanted to put this webinar together to help you all understand what the best metric is, how you can use this to support your journal. So before I do the introduction, some quick housekeeping items from, if you haven't heard the earlier ones. You're all in listen-only mode. So if you wanted to ask a question, please use the chat, and we'll take note of your questions, and then I'll ask them as part of the question and answer session at the end of the webinar. But feel free to pose them at any time, and I'll collect them as the webinar goes on. This will be recorded, and we will have a link available after the webinar is finished if you wanted to follow the recording later or to send it to people as part of your who are in your editorial team. So I'd like to introduce Judy Luther and October Ivins to you, who will be presenting today. They are from Informed Strategies. Judy created Informed Strategies in 1997 to bring a customer-oriented perspective to the design and development of electronic products and services. Her experience includes 12 years managing sales at the Institute for Scientific Information, preceded by 13 years managing academic libraries. Judy is active in the publisher and library communities and is frequently found at meetings that focus on industry initiatives or emerging topics. She is a frequent industry speaker and is a past president for the Society for Scholarly Publishing and has served on the boards of the North American Serials Interest Group and the Association for Information and Dissemination Centers. October Ivins specializes in collaborative projects that help libraries, information producers and vendors analyze environmental changes and develop opportunities. She specialized in serials acquisitions and user support as an academic librarian at the University of North Carolina and Louisiana State. Her fascination with the challenges of scholarly publishing led first to professional association activities to identify common ground for publishers, librarians, and vendors, and later as part of a self-designed doctoral program. October is a frequent speaker at industry meetings, addressing the role of small publishers in the scholarly communication ecosystem. So without further ado, I will hand over to them. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rachel. And this is October, and I have a few more thank yous to make. Several people at the press have helped us put this presentation together. In addition to Rachel, it's Rebecca Darksmith, Jeff Hester, Devin Weston, and Gabe Alvaro, and we thank all of you. I also need to thank Tim Beardsley, who's the editor of Bioscience. He reviewed our slides and was a co-presenter yesterday in the one from a science perspective, and his feedback has been incorporated into the slides you're seeing as well. We're really pleased to be with you today. We have a pretty short outline. I'm going to start out telling you why you should care about this topic. Judy's going to go into more detail about the metrics that we're discussing and what they're based on and how they're constructed. We will then come into the part that you're probably the most interested in, what you can do to use them. And finally, we'll have a discussion part where Rachel will send us your questions. Okay, why should you care? Well, you should care because a lot of other people care. Your authors care because publishing in a journal with an impact factor may be one of the criterion for promotion and tenure. Even if someone is not in a tenure situation, since the impact factor was originally applied only to a small group of journals. Not all that were eligible were in the Thomson database that produced them. Simply having an impact factor connotes prestige, and having a high impact factor, of course, is even more prestigious. If your authors apply for grants, grant reviewers may actively or in another way consider the impact factor. That is, the grant agency may actually assign impact factors to the application that comes in. So the reviewers are aware of the impact factor of places where the authors previously published and where they intend to share their results. So all of that means that, all things being equal, given the scope and focus of the journals available to them, authors will generally choose to submit their manuscript to the one with the highest impact factor. We've also learned that in some countries, faculty who publish in high prestige journals actually get paid. Unfortunately, not in the U.S. Okay. Why publishers care? Well, the reasons publishers care are similar, because the impact factor affects the quality and quantity of submissions to your journals. It is an important indicator of quality that the publisher can use in promoting and marketing your journal. The impact factor itself is not considered in isolation, but within an assigned discipline category. And within that category, a journal rank is assigned. So those are also useful. Having an impact factor generally means that the title is broadly distributed and indicates a global audience, which is more important every day. And again, summing up all of these prior reasons, the bottom line is that publishers expect journals with high impact factors to sell better. Librarians care too. And this is something that I worked on as an academic librarian when we were having to conduct journals reviews or cancellation reviews, where we would actually look at, we wanted to serve all of our users. So cost per use, which is the second bullet, addresses more, it's a very broad measure. You're not exactly sure who's doing the use. It's largely undergraduates who are not very discriminating. So, that's useful. You want your students to find things they can use. But it's also very important to know that you're serving your faculty and graduate students who are the authors of these titles. And you want to see where they're publishing and what journals they cite. The cost per use has become more and more important because libraries are moving from a period of building their collections, where they maintain what they already have and add new titles every year, to simply providing access. So if the cost per use means that it's cheaper to buy something, an article at a time, libraries will cancel the subscription and move to pay-per-view for a particular title. And again, the impact factor, and I'm saying impact factor in all of these introductory slides, and that's almost a stand-in for value metrics. I mean, often it is the impact factor, but more and more people are considering additional metrics, not just the impact factor itself. So since they're looking at that and deciding whether or not to retain a title, that has an impact on revenue. And the reason this is important, this is a slide I could have used 10 years ago. As we know, the environment for scholarly communication and scholarly publishing is changing very rapidly. I mean, it seems to me like it changes more rapidly each year. But some things are a constant. More journals are being published every year. And one thing that is really influencing libraries is that there's more demand, not just from Google and other open discovery tools, but libraries have very sophisticated proprietary discovery tools that identify content that the library may not own. And this is where pay-per-view comes in. It was very eye-opening to me to hear a presentation by a librarian at Harvard at a conference last fall saying that Harvard is being challenged by this. The era when they felt they could be pretty confident they were providing most of what their users needed is over. That they're getting reports daily of content people need that Harvard cannot afford to subscribe to. So another factor that's going on in this environment is, we're all aware of the national and international recession. Well, the way that impacts library budgets is that a library that has an increase in their budget from one year to the next since 2008 is really in a minority. It's much more common for libraries to have their budgets cut, and there are many that just have flat budgets. Well, if journals continue to increase in price each year, a flat budget actually will not go as far as it did the previous year, hence the need for these elaborate and sophisticated cancellation reviews that I was mentioning. And this is an example of how those metrics are used in reviews. The California Digital Library, which you're probably familiar with, that is a service organization that reports to the University of California System President's Office. They provide services to all 10 of the University of California campuses. They negotiate licenses on their behalf for large subscription products and other databases. Well, they too have to make renewal decisions. They can't afford to keep everything, and they have to make room to buy new products that are in more demand. So this slide was taken from a presentation that an analyst at the California Digital Library made to a group of her peers, made to other librarians who are involved in making these kind of collection assessment decisions. And she laid out how they use metrics in their renewal decision process. So in their case, the CDL uses two different quality metrics. They use the impact factor, which you're probably more familiar with, but they also use the SNP, a newer metric from Elsevier, which stands for Source Normalized Impact Per Paper. You'll hear a lot more about that from Judy, but that's one to keep your eye on. They also look at utility. So a high number of article downloads as measured by Counter, which is an international standard to make sure downloads are being calculated oranges to oranges and not apples to oranges, is one thing they look at. They also look at these citation studies. They see it where the faculty are citing journals, just like we used to do at LSU and UNC. They are also using cost effectiveness. So they're calculating not just a cost per use that tells them whether a subscription is a better value than individual pay-per-view. They're also looking at a cost per SNP. So again, in an era of shrinking resources where you can't pay for everything you want, libraries are getting very sophisticated about deciding what they keep. Judy?
Thank you, October. Well, the market has indeed been changing. That's the scholarly communications or scholarly publishing arena. And to keep up with it, newer metrics are being developed. In preparing for this presentation, we took a look at the landscape, and we thought we would identify the area that we're going to focus on here on the right side with journals. There is the H index, the Hirsch index, which is focused on authors based on the citations to their papers, but that is and balanced against the rest of their works. But that's not an area we're going to take a look at. the article influence, which is a byproduct of the eigenfactor, focuses on articles, and we really won't be focusing on that. Our attention today will be focused on the journal. The impact factor is most commonly used in the industry. The eigenfactor and SJR and SNP are the newcomers on the block, and we'll be addressing those as well. We're interested in getting a little feedback from you at this point as to your familiarity, which will help us here. So perhaps you could respond to this poll by indicating your degree of familiarity with Thompson's impact factor, whether you're not familiar with it at all, you've heard of it, or you're actually using it. All right, and it's a pretty even distribution. All right, this obviously is adjusting as more people are responding, and now it looks like we have everyone, and half of you have heard of it, and the other half are split pretty evenly between less familiarity with it and actually using it. I'm going to ask the question again in regards to Elsevier's two new metrics, SJR and SNP. So perhaps you could respond to those as well. All right, this one went very quickly, and as we might expect, they really haven't had a chance to become well enough known yet for you to be familiar with it. They were just introduced in the last 2 years. Well, looking at the journal metric landscape, there are really two significant players. The Institute for Scientific Information, Eugene Garfield founded, and the primary focus of that became the Science Citation Index, then the Social Science Citation Index. And there's even an Arts and Humanities Index, but that does not contribute to the measurement of impact factors. When they were bought by Thomson, today they're known as Thomson Reuters, and the product today is known as Web of Science or Web of Knowledge, depending on how broadly it's cast. Eugene Garfield founded this in the 1960s. The coverage goes back to 1900. They've been around the longest in terms of tracking these citations, and they really patterned it on the legal field of precedence, which is why it works really well in the sciences. And not so well in the arts and humanities. The focus of Thomson has really been, if you look at these, this number of 12,000 journals, was really meant to be very focused on the journals that they felt had the most influence based on their data. Up until a few years ago, that number was closer to 8,000. And just this year, when they released the impact factors for 2010, which come out in the summer of 2011, they had added over 1,000 journals to the file. So the impact factor is their metric, and the eigenfactor is one that they have helped support the development of, and they distribute in with their own metrics. And we'll speak to that in a few minutes, but it actually seeks to add another element to the calculation. Elsevier, whom you all know of as a publisher, created Scopus as a similar abstracting and indexing database, but with the intent of being much larger. Given the total range of journals in the world today, they actually are up to 18,000, and I expect they're still growing, 18,000 journals. And their coverage goes back to 1996, which is about the time when content started being available in digital form. So they don't go back nearly as far, but they're larger, they're broader, they're going to be more inclusive than the Web of Knowledge. They only started five years ago. So they're quite new, but Elsevier has, as you might expect, substantial resources to devote to this. And Scopus is becoming a reasonably well-established database. They supported the introduction of two new factors, the SJR and what is being called the SNP. And we'll describe each of these in sequence to give you a better feel for them. Starting with Thomson's impact factor, which you're more familiar with, this is a journal metric, as they all are, that began with this formula, which is basically the formula that is used in all of the metrics. It's the number of sites. I'll clean this up so you can see it. The number of sites divided by the number of articles in a journal. The sites to the journal divided by the number of articles in it. What this basically gives you is an average citation level per article for the journal. This is done in periods of either 2 years, the current year's worth of citations, to articles published in the last 2 years, or article published in the last 5 years. The various factors that will affect the impact factor. The impact factor can be raised if you include review articles because, as you might understand, these are highly cited articles with staying power through the years typically. Journal self-citations, it's useful to note, are monitored. One way that some publishers, editors have attempted to improve their impact factor is not just by including review articles, but having authors cite prior articles in that same journal. If they reach above a certain level, Thomson will take note of that, and we'll have an example later on where they actually take some action. So this is something that's monitored. But other things that affect what the meaning of the impact factor are the number of articles that are in a journal. As you can see in the denominator, that would make a difference. And the number of years covered will also make a difference, especially with disciplines. Disciplines vary considerably based on the nature of the subject matter, and therefore the citation patterns will vary dramatically. You can have an impact factor in the life sciences and biology as high as 30, 40, and math and the social sciences are more likely to be around 5, 6, 10. So that doesn't mean that the social science and humanities or sciences aren't as active as the life sciences. It means that the volume of citations per article is dramatically different. There's not as much need to cite, and the speed with which articles are cited is dramatically different. In the life sciences, citations can start as soon as the article is actually published, or sometimes in its pre-release stage, whereas math doesn't even begin to cite until about the 3rd year. So they completely miss this first 2-year period for citation. So it makes a big difference, and it's had an impact in terms of the perspective people have on these numbers. October has put together some interesting data here from the journal citation reports that she'll go over with you.
Thanks, Judy.
October, I can't hear you. You'll need to adjust your mic.
Can you hear me now?
Better. Great.
Yeah, I was trying not to cough while you were talking, so sorry. Okay, you will notice that these are science disciplines for the most part, and it's because I found such a beautiful example here of category diversity that I wanted to go ahead and use this one instead of one from the social sciences. In this example, this group of a dozen similar titles actually appear in 7 different categories. So one thing that does is really affect the rank within the category. Here's one, animal behavior, 5th out of a group, a category with 145 titles in it, which is a really high ranking. There's a spinoff into behavioral science, which is much smaller and newer. It only has 48 titles in it. And there, the ranking is proportionally much lower. That's what, about a little lower than 25%, rather than, top 2%. And without knowing anything about these journals in particular, just making observations based on the evidence here, you would assume that They're rated highly in zoology because that's all about animal behavior. It's lower in behavioral science where they're competing with articles about human behavior. Okay. Here's one, conservation biology, which is in ecology as sort of their main category, also in environmental science and biodiversity. And a third example, the Journal of Wildlife Management, is in zoology and in ecology. Many of these others, although they're similar, are only in a single category. So I guess the moral there is that depending on who your cohort is, the journals that you think your authors might also be submitting to, or that you're tracking and consider your frenemies or your competitors, they may not be in the same category as you, which doesn't mean you can't monitor them, just that it's a little more complicated. So this is primarily an example of journal rank, which I explained is different than impact factor.
October, rather than going ahead, let me go back. A question has arisen, and I think it would be useful just to clarify. Cora, thanks for your question about 2 years and 5 years. This calculation is based on the number of citations that occurs in the current year to articles published in that journal in the prior 2 years. It doesn't have to do with the limitations or the how new the journal is or how long it's been published. It just has to do with the publication period covered. And then it's the number of articles in the number of potential articles that could have been cited in that journal in that same time period. So the citations to articles in the current year that occurred during the current year to articles that were published in the prior 2 years.
Right, and Judy, that's the impact factor proper, that particular metric. Thomson has a different metric that they call the 5-year impact factor.
And it's calculated in the same way, except instead of the citation window being based on 2 years, it's based on 5 years. And it's called the 5-year impact factor. But the impact factor as it stands is normally covering 2 years. That's not the same window that some of these other metrics cover. So that is related to the disciplines and the challenge some disciplines have with the impact factor. Because the discipline categories, the citation behavior varies, the impact factor is relevant typically within a category, but as I pointed out earlier, it doesn't really work across different disciplines, particularly within the academy. The impact factors will have much higher numbers for the life sciences because they cite much faster and they cite more often and they have longer citation lists within the first 2 years compared to math, even engineering, and the social sciences. But because for many years the impact factor has been the only metric we've had for over 40 years, it has been used in ways for which it was never intended. And there are disclaimers about that by Thomson, even though it still continues to occur. This is particularly problematic if your title is in an interdisciplinary area and your colleagues know their discipline, but perhaps not yours, and don't realize that a lower number doesn't mean that your content isn't as valuable as the content in their journal. The impact factor has been used, even though it's an average across all the articles in a journal, it has been used sometimes in evaluating faculty for promotion and tenure and has been applied to a specific article in a journal, and that's just not correct. Research has shown that that number cannot be used in that way effectively. But because it was the only metric, it has lent itself to applications for which it was just never intended. But that being said, there have been a couple of new measures that have emerged, including the eigenfactor being one of these, that was seeking to consider other elements that were deemed important. And the eigenfactor looks at the prestige of the journal citing your journal. It's similar to the Google PageRank, where the results fall in a list of search results is influenced by the number of links to the web page that's where the citation is, or linking to your item. In a similar manner, eigenfactor takes the prestige of the journals that are citing your journal and use that as a variable on higher than or lower than 1 to inflate or deflate the value of the citation to your article. The other significant thing about the eigenfactor is where Thomson had, back in the day, pre-designated categories to make sure they were covering the appropriate journals in a category. Eigenfactor is far more fluid, and it really maps the citation data in such a way that the categories emerge from the data. It's not something that is predetermined. The limitations, however, are that it has to be a title with an impact factor because it's deriving the data from that. And the second thing is that the size of the journal will affect, based on the number of articles in the denominator, will affect the eigenfactor score. The developers of the eigenfactor, who are at the University of Washington, have begun working with a number of visuals, and here is an example of one of them, where you can see the heavy citation between molecular and cell biology and medicine, and between molecular and cell biology and neuroscience. You'll see off to the left of that neuroscience, over here is ecology, and then psychology and sociology more towards the back. This was a larger map, but we just wanted to give you a sense of how they work with the data in terms of laying out the disciplines and the fields. Now, Elsevier, the other major player in this space, or publisher in this space for Scopus, has an index that created the underlying metadata that is used for the journal ranking. They created these two metrics, the SJR and the SNP. SJR is the Scimago Journal Rank, and it does something very similar to the eigenfactor. It uses a different approach to weighting it, but it also takes an estimate of the prestige of a journal and assigns it to the calculation so that the journals that are ranked higher as with a higher impact factor, are actually given a stronger weight. So not only is it similar to eigenfactor, but the categories are also fluid and self-organizing. SNP was developed for a totally different reason. SNP was actually developed, its formal name is Source Normalized Impact Per Paper. It doesn't consider prestige at all. It takes the basic impact value, is their name for their impact factor, which is calculated the same way, the number of sites in the last year to the they use 3 prior years, divided by the number of articles published in those 3 years in your journal. And they take that factor as the numerator, and in the denominator, they've come up with another metric that references the citation potential, where they've really added up and averaged the number of references in papers that are citing your journal. This is important because it really balances the difference in citation patterns across the disciplines. If you're working with far fewer citations as the norm, this average of the potential balances that out. And it also works well if you're in a new and emerging field where there aren't a lot of titles or journals in the database covering your topic. You're not at a disadvantage and outsized or outranked because you're not part of a much larger discipline. So SNP balances the scales in a way that SJR and eigenfactor don't. Being one of the new metrics, they're also working with visuals, and this is the Scimago Lab NetViewer. This is the one for the larger works well with larger titles. You can see how big medicine is. Again, biochemistry, genetics, molecular biology, and over here is engineering and physics and astronomy. Math is out here, social sciences up here, and over here is environmental sciences. So again, this is part of a much larger map, but they make for interesting displays, and you can see how the disciplines themselves are growing or are different sizes, and as they change from year to year, you'll be able to see those visually. Once again, we've done, we being October, has done the analysis here for comparison, and this will give you a chance to see how these different measures compare with each other.
Thanks, Judy. Okay, what I've done here is something very artificial, but I've created something that I think will illustrate some of the differences among 6 different metrics. So the metrics are across the top here. What I've done is take, for these 7 categories, experimental psychology, area studies, ethics, management, history and philosophy of science, as you can see, for these groups which are of different sizes. So this first one has 81 journals, this one has 129, etc. So for each of these, I've taken the 10th ranked title, the title that once an impact factor is calculated, it falls in the 10th position within this universe for the category. Okay? So that's how I selected the titles, and then I wanted to see what would happen when we looked at these measures and compared them. So I have a second slide that's going to show you the actual numbers, but it's much easier to understand it from these ranks. These are simply relative position, 1 being the largest impact factor and 7 being the lowest. So I've kept the titles in alphabetical order. I've sorted them, and there's a rank for each one of these metrics that I'm going to try and explain. Okay. Sometimes none of these fields seem to be ones that have a much slower citation pattern. When that's the case, if we were looking at math, if I had thought to include that as an example, we would see the 5-year impact factor be higher than the impact factor. We're not seeing that here. Everything corresponds. So the impact factor proper, the impact factor that's based on citations within the last 2 years, is in the same relative position as the 5-year impact factor. So these are all growing. When we look at the numbers, you'll see that all of these numbers are higher, but the relative positions to these other titles doesn't change. Okay, then we come to the eigenfactor, which is using prestige. So here we do see a few differences. This shift between second position and first position indicates that although relatively fewer, although this title, Biological Psychology, has relatively fewer citations than the Journal of Management Studies, they come from titles with higher impact factors. So when we talk about the eigenfactor having the impact of intensifying the impact factor, because that's what it's based on, here's an example of that. It's sort of compounded the impact factor effect because it's looking at what sites. Here's another title, Journal of Business Ethics, where something similar has happened, only this one has moved up 2 positions. Okay. So another thing to look at, knowing that both eigenfactor and Scimago journal rank are prestige measurements, we would expect to see these to be fairly similar, these 2 columns. And for the most part, they are. However, here's one where they're not. This one is moved from the 5th position to the 3rd. And in this case, we can speculate, based on what we know about how the metrics are constructed, that it's because it's a bigger universe. The SJR is based on a database that is a third again as large as the database the eigenfactor uses. That's the most likely explanation here. Okay. Then when we come to the SNP, the source normalized impact per paper, we see some even more interesting results. This one, which has been consistently in the 1st or 2nd position, drops down to 4th, to the middle of the pack. Okay, so what accounts for that? Well, we've been talking about how SNP corrects for disciplinary differences in the number of citations. Okay, the top part of the equation has remained the same. There are the same number of citations for the same number of articles. However, the universe of possible citations is larger. So the SNP has looked at what is the actual length of all, the citations, how many references do articles in this grouping have, and compared to how many citations are typical, it adjusts the SNP either up or down. So this time it's dropped. Although it has a high impact factor and gets heavily cited, it's not as heavily cited as it could be given this self-correcting and very dynamic discipline that's being looked at. Since SJR and SNP don't have pre-assigned categories, the titles that they're comparing a journal to, the titles they're looking at that cite, change every year. It's completely dynamic. So here's one that's gone up, meaning that in this discipline, fewer citations are the norm. So getting this figure, when you say fewer citations, makes it go up. The same with the Academy of Marketing Science. This has gone up by 2 positions. Here's one that's dropped and another one that's dropped. So I hope that was somewhat clear. And I wanted to show you this slide first so you could see the relative positions, because this next slide gives some people a headache. This is what the data looks like. Okay, we've been talking, I didn't think we could do a whole presentation on metrics and not show you the metrics. Well, here they are. These are what impact factors look like. They have 4 decimal points. Some titles have 0 in the 1st position. So we're seeing a group here where, remember, the impact factor is telling you the average number of times an article in this journal has been cited within the last 2 years. Okay? So this title's been cited about 3.5 times. This one not quite 2. This one under 1, a little more than 3. So that's all the impact factor is telling you. How many times an average article in this journal has been cited in the last 2 years. The 5-year impact factor, which I told you should increase, although here's one that hasn't, this should increase because more time has passed. There's been more time to cite articles. So this is what's been cited in a 5-year period, and it generally increases. Just based on this data, I can't tell you why critical Asian studies has declined. I'm sure there's an explanation. I just don't know what it is. Sometimes you will see big jumps here where a title is barely cited in the first 2 years and then jumps a lot. We don't happen to have a discipline that displays that in this group, Okay. Now here's the eigenfactor. People complain, one of the limitations of it, or one of the things people don't like about working with it, is that it just has too many decimals. It's a little bit harder to just do a surface comparison and see how these are similar. But remember, the eigenfactor is pretty closely tied to these two because it's based on the same data, and it uses the impact factor of the citing journals to give a higher rank to citations from those journals and a lower rank to citations with lower impact factors. So sometimes there's a change here. Let's go back and see if that happened this time. Yeah, we did get a little bit of change, and that's what's accounting for that. Okay, with the Scimago journal rank, this is another prestige factor, but remember these two are based on the larger universe. It's a third again as many titles as the eigenfactor in these measures are looking at. So here we do expect to see some more differences, and we did. These rankings actually show a little more difference than we might expect, because the SNP here is taking the potential number of citations that are available. So it's not just the number of journals in your field and the number of articles. This also addresses publication frequency. Quarterlies are going to have fewer articles in a year than something that's published more frequently. So when we were looking at that graph with the sciences having these huge groups of articles, a lot of those published twice a month or daily. There are some that publish weekly. So they just have more articles. They have more content. But the SNP is adjusting for that and is saying, okay, we don't care how many articles you have. What is the average length? How many references are typical given in in an average article? And it adjusted downward. Well, I loved that. You may not have, and we can take questions later on if it wasn't clear. Thank you.
So to recap our takeaways here after looking at this data, and we're about to move on to what you can do about or with the data with these different metrics. Our key takeaways are that there is no perfect metric. We know what some of the imperfections are for the impact factor, and the new ones are also receiving that have been out long enough. The eigenfactor has been around long enough to receive some critical response. SJR and SNP are almost too new to have received much feedback. But it's anticipated, and even the creators of them acknowledge that they're all going to have a bias, their own weaknesses. Having said that, the impact factor is still very prominent, but new metrics are beginning to address some of the areas that it hasn't done as good a job with. And I think it's particularly important in the social sciences to take a look at the categories that you're in. This would actually really apply to all disciplines, but in the social sciences, if you're in a niche discipline, you're going to feel the impact factors weight perhaps a little more strongly. And you also could see the influence of the eigenfactor because it tends to favor large and rapidly citing fields. If you're in an emerging area, interdisciplinary journals may also be better represented through a system that has more organic creation of the categories. And certainly you may want to be considering SJR and SNP if you're in a field where the citation pace is slower or there are fewer citations. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what you can do. And we're taking the approach of looking at this from the role of the editor, the role of the author, and the role of the publisher.
Thanks, Judy. Well, the first thing I want to say about what you can do in using these metrics, some people find it distasteful to consider manipulating the impact factor as an end in itself, and that's not at all what we're recommending. We're talking about things that can help you improve the quality of your journal that will, as a byproduct, also improve its competitive position and perhaps increase some of these metrics. So one of the things to do is to sort of figure out your cohort. Where else do your authors submit manuscripts? Because it's really useful to track them and to look for new entrants. That's another thing some of these reports can do for you, is see new titles that are being cited in your area that you may not have come across yet. And determining the unique contribution of your journal. It really helps authors who are trying to submit if there's a policy statement that shows the kind of research you want to attract. What are your goals? What are you especially interested in? Your editorial board appointments are critical. These, you can't do it all yourself. So these people can really help you attract authors. They can go to conferences and hear presentations and give people a card and say, I'd love to see this in my journal. With more and more global research being done, it's very helpful to have an editorial board that reflects that. And in terms of editorial policy, niche content that develops new and emerging ideas, this content can be very highly cited. There aren't a lot of outlets for it. So if you can showcase something that's new and different, that may work very well. Themed issues are very popular and often get well cited, especially if you can attract an editor who can be announced as part of the promotion for soliciting articles. We've already said review articles do really well, and if you don't want to publish more review articles, you can encourage your authors to include fairly extensive literature reviews as an introduction to their research. Topical areas rather than continuing studies seem to get cited more. Now that may not fit your profile, and you certainly shouldn't change it if that's not appropriate for you, but that is something that will have an effect. And if you've had, you can look at who your top cited authors are and ask them for new papers. I mean, a good author generally continues to be a good author. You can also spot stars in other areas and ask them to write for you. And again, recognizing the international nature of scholarship. International submissions can cause extra work, but they do also get extra readership and citations. In the editorial process, it's important to keep the review process timely. Every author wants to be published the day after tomorrow, but that will encourage people to return and publish with you again if they feel like there's a nice, speedy process. The abstracts are really critical. With all of these discovery tools, that's the main thing that they're drawing their references from. If you can keep a speedy review turnaround, you'll have more content available to be cited within the 2-year window. And this one can be a little tricky. You don't want to encourage gratuitous self-citation or journal self-citation. In fact, if that is taken to an extreme, Thomson will penalize a journal and put it in a timeout. They won't index you for a couple of years until you clean up your act. but there are certainly appropriate places where an author may have sent in a manuscript and they just haven't seen. It's sort of crossed in the mail where they did not see a newer article in your journal, and it's certainly appropriate to point that out to them. Making key articles freely available, at least for a short period of time, can also help. Judy?
When we look at what authors can do, there are a number of things that they can be encouraged to do. This first bullet, however, points to the cautioning remark that October made and I referenced earlier. We have a page of references for you, and in there is one to a blog called The Scholarly Kitchen. That's an award-winning blog, and they cite the example just this past 2 weeks of the World Journal of Gastroenterology, which was introduced a few years ago, was rising nicely in terms of their impact factor, but then was noticed to be increasing a little too rapidly. And when Thomson did their evaluation, as they do each year, it had exceeded what they considered the norms for citation. Now, this is not authors citing each other, citing themselves. This is a publication carrying articles that cite that publication. So this is the very reason why we would not suggest that that be encouraged, but where appropriate, acknowledging, as October said, articles that are relevant and in the journal are important, especially when you're publishing in a different publication. Creating review articles we've already mentioned, and an extensive citation list can make a difference. And again, this is only where it's appropriate. We're not suggesting this where it's not. But this long list might fit better in some disciplines than in others. The next three things are activities authors can do that would be in their own best interests in terms of increasing visibility of their work. They can publicize articles within their own communities, either discussing them or referencing them in blogs or in presentations. They can place a final manuscript in the institutional repository at their institution, and with a link to the final published version of the article. And they can also cite articles on their personal web page. Most faculty have these, and it's a good opportunity to generate a link, particularly since those pages are crawled by Google. And Google Scholar is the leading source of access to journal literature today. There are also a few things that publishers can do. And in fact, this first one, publish on time and without delays, is actually essential if you want to be considered for inclusion in the citation indexes. It's also true for being included in Scopus. And when you think about the citation window, it's really important to have timely published content, not only for the author's sake, but also because it impacts the citation analysis. If you have a quarterly publication and 5 issues come out one year and 3 issues come out the next year, it really does skew the metrics and the opportunities to cite those articles in a timely way. Where there's the opportunity to publish ahead of print, that is definitely of benefit in the citation world and is encouraged. And the University of California Press encourages its societies and editors to make broad calls for submission. And this can be done, and a number of publishers do this in different ways. We just list a couple of options here. You can place ads. JSTOR is one place to do that. Another one would be to use social media and reference this release. And, of course, a press release can be very good for key articles that you may want to highlight. This has been done nicely in the business world, and bridging the area from theory to practice, where the content is primarily of interest. to faculty within the academy, but there's impact definitely in the practitioner field. And a press release can bring attention to this if it's circulated to the more popular business press, the Wall Street Journal, Business Week, The Economist, and result in nice citations to the article and to the author. This wraps up our ideas that we have to share with you, and we'd like to open the floor now to questions that you may have for us in regards to what we've had to say, or any comments or observations you wish to share.
Right, and they may have additional suggestions too.
So I've just had a question come in from Marilyn Fernandez that says, does UC Press provide its journals with the 2 new scores? I am happy to look these up, and I will circulate to the client managers, and they will send these back to you. So I hope that answers your question. Please let me know if you have any follow-up comments. And a couple of other general questions that have come in for October and Judy. The first one says, which value metric should I focus on the most? And how do I determine which is most appropriate for my journal?
Judy, you want me to do this one?
That would be great, October. Go right ahead.
Yeah. Well, I think it's hard to know until you've actually looked at the data. So what I would suggest is looking at all 6 of the ones we presented today. And I would do some benchmarking since it's you can't forecast, you can't go into the future yet. I would start maybe look at 10 years ago, look at 5 years ago, or if there was a time when there was a significant transition, if you're a new editor and started 2 years ago, you might want to do a before and after. Just kind of, sample maybe 4 different periods, including the most recent one. See what the trends look like. I would do this not just for your own journals, but for your cohort, the 4 to 8 titles that you want to track that you think are the most similar to you. And once you've looked at that, I suspect you're going to find that the Scimago Journal Rank and the SNP are going to be the most appropriate since you're all social science journals. But there may be a surprise. I mean, disciplines really vary. And a discipline like sociology, which is long established, and the journals I looked at in sociology are not in multiple Thompson categories. So that one may work perfectly well in the Thompson metrics.
Yes, another example of that would be bioinformatics, which is a really hot topic and is highly rated, but much more so than the statistics category that it's in. So sometimes the subfield will make a big difference.
We've just had a quick question from Paul Perry asking if we can get a copy of the slide presentation, and I wanted to remind everybody that we are recording this, and I will send a link, or your client managers will send you a link to the recording after this webinar has wrapped up. Paul also had a question that he wanted us to discuss a bit more, the annual report for social sciences. I don't know if October and Judy, you can talk about the category generally. Paul, if you have more specific questions now, it would be good to hear that.
To make sure that we address your question.
Right. Well, I can start while we're waiting for Paul to provide more information. One of the things we used in putting this together are the journal summary list that comes from the JCR every year. And what it is available as a PDF, and it has a lot of different information. It has the list of all of the titles in the category, including your title, because you would get the one for your title and your discipline. So you can see all the journals that it considers to be in the same category. And then it has all of the metrics going across, but only the Thompson metrics. So of the ones we've looked at, it'll have impact factor, 5-year impact factor, and eigenfactor. There are 4 other metrics that are on here, which you may want to look at. You may find them useful. There are things like the immediacy impact, the total number of articles, the cited half-life, meaning what is the age of the titles that get cited, and also an article influence score, which is derived from the eigenfactor. It goes on to give you additional information that may be useful to you. It actually breaks down how the metrics are derived and shows you how your scores are calculated. So if you got that every year and then supplemented it by looking up the corresponding SNP and SJRs for the same period, I think you'd have a good basis to start with. Paul, is that what you needed to know?
Yeah. Well, if you have any other follow-up questions, anybody, including Paul and the JPS team, please feel free to send them to your client managers, and we can certainly field them for you afterwards. And I guess we've got time for one final question, which is, how are the categories determined in these value metric systems? Is there a way that a journal can influence which category it appears or doesn't appear in?
Thank you for that question. The categories do vary on these newer metrics because they're organic and they're generated from the data. But where they're assigned by Thompson, Thompson is accustomed to receiving questions from editors and publishers about the cohort that their title appears in. The impact factor is assigned only once, but the rank actually is determined by the category you're in, and as October showed, the rank will vary from category to category. So you can inquire or petition Thompson to consider that you should be in either a second category, because you can be in more than one, excuse me, or that you might need to change categories. I've seen titles misassigned at times by accident, and Thompson is certainly receptive to getting feedback. However, they are the final arbiter and may or may not agree with your assessment of the situation. So there is an opportunity to be heard in that regard.
Great. Thank you very much. So it's time now to wrap up, and I wanted to thank October and Judy for presenting, and the rest of you for dialing in and listening. If you have any questions, as I mentioned earlier, please send them to your client managers, and we'll be able to get back to you with a response. And we also have a list of further readings that we can send out to you if you wanted to delve a bit deeper into what this all means. But thank you very much.
Thanks for your attention, everybody. We've enjoyed it.
We appreciated your questions, too.